It's not just that Columbus must be dismantled, but Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, the Pilgrims, the pioneers, and every other part of our history that involves some form of Christian or European descendant. The radicals want to destroy the West and everything that it stands for. Parents, please don't play their game. The 21st century critics of Columbus who topple statues and feign morality would not be able to do half of what Columbus did. Despite some miscalculations and misidentifications, and despite some errors in judgment, he was an amazing person who was born to accomplish great things, and the stories that are being told today are simply untrue. What are we going to do about the story of Christopher Columbus? As a homeschool mom and a history buff, I get a lot of questions about Christopher Columbus. Parents are hesitant to expose their children to someone that they think is a genocidal maniac, rapist, murderer. And so they just try to hurry over the lessons about Christopher Columbus, but they, and possibly you, believe this way because of just recent decades of revisionist history. So what I want to do today is help unpack how we got here and what did Americans know and believe about Christopher Columbus before this revisionist history started. So I call it the twisted history of Christopher Columbus. I've been blogging about this for many, many years. And when I say that, I'm not referring to Columbus himself. I'm referring to the revising of a story that was set down in print long ago. I'm talking about why you can't just take a modern interpretation of a very old story and change it and repackage it and judge it by modern standards. I want to show you how to avoid doing that. So in the 21st century, as you know, it's nearly impossible to talk about Christopher Columbus in a rational conversation. The revisionist history population has done such a thorough job of making us feel hateful and bitter toward a man who they believe single-handedly committed genocide during his murderous voyage to the New World. But there is so much more to the story. So who do you trust? How do you know? Well, as I always say, first-hand accounts and primary sources are the most accurate way to understand all of history, and specifically Columbus and his men and their times and their actions. Columbus and his men kept journals and wrote letters. Columbus was a prolific journalist, and he carefully noted his highs and his lows. He wrote about his call to spread the gospel around the world, and he wrote about his miserable failings towards God and his country. He was honest about everything that happened. It's all there to read if people would just take the time. So I talk about Columbus every single year as a homeschool mom and as a history buff, not because I think he is some perfect godlike figure, but for two reasons. First, because his achievements were world-changing, and second, because his story, as we know it right now, illustrates just how many falsehoods Americans are willing to believe. So I want to go way back in time and help you to understand that Columbus's history as an American heroic figure spans centuries. There was a very long period of American history where Columbus was honored for his accomplishments. In fact, Columbia was the name first debated for our country, and it was informally called this for 2 centuries. Before there was the Statue of Liberty, there was another Lady Liberty, and her name was Columbia. Columbina or Columbia is the feminine form of Columbus. And before 1700, Columbia came to represent the colonies. And after the Revolution was won, it came to represent liberty and the United States of America. Now, if you go searching the web for the history of this fact, you'll find writers who tell you that the newly freed colonies were just scrambling for something non-British to call the country, and that they hastily adopted the moniker of Columbia because they didn't have anything better. I guess a memo went out because that's the standard internet story now, but that is not true. So let's just look at a short history of Columbia before we move on to the rest of the story of Columbus. In 1697, Samuel Sewall wrote of Columbina as an emblem of a new heaven in the American colonies. By the 1730s, the name Columbia became shorthand for the 13 colonies. I don't know if you're aware that England, Great Britain has always had the name Britannia. This is the American version of that, Columbia. In 1738, the term Columbia was used as a reference to America in a London magazine called Gentleman's Magazine. In 1784, after the colonists had won the Revolution and were ready to begin building a new nation and a new government, they didn't want any American things called anything British. So King's College was renamed Columbia. In 1786, Columbia, South Carolina became the first United States city to be named in honor of the explorer Columbus. Leaders in the state legislature at the time were trying to determine where the state capital would be located and what its name would be. So they went back and forth between Washington and Columbia, and Columbia won by a vote of 11-7. In 1787, future President John Quincy Adams, who was the son of another future president, John Adams, gave his Harvard graduation speech and said, "Ye daughters of Columbia, your country calls." Also in 1787, there were two ships named Columbia and Washington that first set sail towards the northwest coast in that year. John Kendrick was captain of the Columbia, and Captain Robert Gray led the Washington. Do you notice how Washington and Columbia are the two names that are settled on most as the fathers of this country? So in 1789, the Columbia, the ship, became the first U.S. ship to circumnavigate the globe. Captain Robert Gray discovered the mouth of the Columbia River in 1792. So he named the river after Columbia, his ship, after Columbus. In 1790, the U.S. Congress established a 100 square mile territory to serve as the permanent seat of the federal government. It was called the District of Columbia, and inside that district was the city of Washington. In 1793, Hail Columbia was an Independence Day celebration song. By the Revolutionary era, Columbia had evolved into a neoclassical goddess, and you will recognize Columbia when you see her. Hail Columbia became the unofficial national anthem sung throughout the 1700s and 1800s. It is actually still the ceremonial entrance march for the Vice President of the United States. Columbia appeared in political cartoons, guiding westward expansion as the spirit of manifest destiny. She led the way westward in John Gast's famous painting, American Progress, lighting horizon as she soars above telegraph wires, railroads, and travelers. In 1893, you may be familiar with the Chicago World's Fair, but it was also called the World's Columbian Exposition. But sadly, this was going to be about the end of Columbia's reign. The Statue of Liberty, as you remember, had come to America in 1886, and she eventually took the place of Columbia as Lady Liberty. Uncle Sam also gained prominence, taking Columbia's place on war posters. Are you familiar with Columbia Pictures? They adapted the Lady Liberty as their logo, I think, in the early 1920s, and it still remains today. In 1931, President FDR officially replaced Hail Columbia with the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem. So that's just a little bit of history of where we get the name Columbia, because over 2 million Americans live in 54 counties, districts, cities, incorporated towns, boroughs, villages, and census-designated places named after Christopher Columbus. Let's fast forward to today. Now, in over 130 cities and at least 8 states, the official holiday, known as Columbus Day, has been repealed. States no longer celebrate Columbus Day, and they include North Carolina, Vermont, Alaska, South Dakota, Oregon, Minnesota, New Mexico, and oddly, the District of Columbia. In place of Columbus Day, we all know most have instituted an Indigenous Peoples Day to honor the native peoples of America from various locales. So what changed? Columbus is one of the most clear examples of how the masses have easily convinced us to accept a clumsy and revised history. What Americans and what a lot of the Western world think about Columbus illustrates a nearly complete triumph for progressive Marxists, not just in education, but society at large. The modern narrative of Christopher Columbus sounds a little something like this. Tell me if this sounds familiar. He was inherently racist. He hated Indians. He was the single most destructive force in the history of the world. He was a rapist, he was also an evil white male. And the modern narrative of Indians sounds something like this. They were minding their own business in their secluded part of the world. They were kind and loving. They were anti-war. They lived in peaceful community with all other Indians. They were happy, healthy, and safe before Columbus came. Mary Graybar wrote in her book Debunking Howard Zinn that Zinn describes the world before Columbus came kind of on a second grade level, that everyone was loving and sharing and kind. I'm sure you've heard all these claims, and I wouldn't be surprised if you believe them and assume they're true. It's preached as gospel truth by well-educated people, and it's been repeated so much in our generation that it seems to be the accepted true history, but it's not. So where did we learn this? Unfortunately, this little book right here is the culprit. Howard Zinn. In his 1980 book, A People's History of the United States of America, he opens his reimagined history book with a whole new version of Columbus. He even calls it The Untold Story. But Zinn's version is actually the original story with a lot of important facts purposely omitted. While he is quoting parts of Columbus's journals, he carefully selects the parts that make Columbus appear to be a slaver and a heartless overseer. He weaves a tale that makes Columbus appear as the genocidal rapist that the masses now believe he was. In addition, he paints pictures of the Indians as a peaceful community of friends who live in complete harmony, who have never heard of murder or rape or theft. It was actually Zinn who suggested renaming Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. But Zinn's history book has become a standard resource for college students and professors, and it made its way into high schools across America. I've actually been contacted by so many people who say, yeah, we read that in our AP high school history classes. And then with the explosion of social media, his ideas have become the material for thousands of influencers, cementing revisionist history as fact in the minds of millions of purposely uneducated Americans. And here we are, homeschoolers in the 21st century, afraid to discuss Columbus or to teach our children about him because we have fallen for this revisionist history of a card-carrying communist author whose fake history has been debunked hundreds of times over. Parents, we've got to be critical thinkers. We must seek the truth. Critical thinkers look at the historic record, examine it in the context of its time, and read the stories as they were written. While social media influencers peddle themselves off as historians, we cannot just allow them to snip the official narrative into pieces and then reassemble it into a more enticing story and call it good. If a historical figure was bad, we can truthfully admit that. If a historical figure was not bad, we should also be willing to truthfully admit that. But we are witnessing a movement that looks at all of history through this lens. Heroes, especially white European males, were always bad, and the underdog was always good. That's what happened to Christopher Columbus. But he's not alone. It has happened to pretty much any white European or American male in the past 500 years of world history, just to be clear. But because it's Columbus Day, it's a good time to start with the villain that the Marxists started with. You can see the dominoes fall from there. Jeff Finn Paul, in his book Not Stolen, which is a highly recommended book, puts it this way. They believe the only morally acceptable way to write history is to foreground exploitation of non-white people by white people. So our biblical worldview actually matters when we are reading history. As Christians, we can actually look to the scriptures to help us form our thinking on all topics. In this case, it's important to remember that the Bible talks about sin. Each human is born into sin, all skin colors, all ethnicities, all humans in every culture. The Bible says that no one is without sin in 1 John 1:8. There is none righteous. That includes the Indians of the North and South American continents. It also includes the white European males who came here. They did not bring some European systemic racism because there is no such thing. Racism does exist, but it is sin in the heart of man that produces racism. It's not limited to certain societies or skin colors or time periods. Columbus and his men were fallen humans just like you and me. They had lofty ambitions like you and me. And unfortunately, their humanity collided with their lofty ambitions. Before we go further, I want you to ask yourself, who is the dominant group that maligns Columbus's achievements by calling him a rapist and blaming him for single-handedly murdering millions of Indians. It's the same group that screeches for the right to murder unborn babies, and the same group that is mutilating the bodies of children in the name of trans identity, both in secret and in the open. Their concern is fake. It's false outrage. They aren't concerned about what happened to the Indians. They just need an outlet for perpetual outrage. James Lindsay talked about this on my last podcast, which is about the Marxification of education. And he says that the issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. He talks about perpetual revolution. As soon as one revolution dies down, whether they succeeded or not, they move on to another revolution. So we should, and we do, acknowledge the wrongs that were done to many Indians by European settlers. But we should also face the reality that it is much more complicated. You can't generalize an entire people, whether Europeans or Indians, with one adjective. Within each group were hundreds of little groups doing and believing vastly different things, just like today. So let's examine Columbus's story, some of the myths that are told as fact, and see if they're actually true. So I will not argue that Columbus and his men were holy, righteous apostles. I want to be very clear about that. But they also were not evil tyrants bent on subduing an entire civilization and destroying its inhabitants. So let's go back and look at the story of Columbus without the modern twist. First, how do we know? How do we know what Columbus's intentions actually were? His journals. He wrote it down in all of his journals, and he petitioned many rulers of Europe for their help with letters. He wrote to them about his plans and his ambitions. His goals were always to find a new route to the Orient, to convert the natives of the lands discovered to Christianity, and to hopefully find gold to help pay for the wars that Spain had fought against the Muslims. Long before he set sail in 1492, these were his well-documented goals. Christopher Columbus did not just randomly hop on a boat seeking a civilization to destroy. His story, like all parts of world history, were part of a much bigger story. You see, while he was spending years learning about the art of map making and navigation, thinking about the shape of the earth and planning a route to the Indies, Spain was in the midst of a very long war against Islam. Centuries of war, including the Crusades, had been fought to keep the Muslim invaders back from Europe. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, who were the Muslims of the time, had blocked up trade routes to the east, cutting off access to products that the Europeans had come to depend on. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain were waging war in their own homeland against the Turks. Dr. John Eidsmoe wrote a book about Columbus and Cortez, and he says this: in 1469, Queen Isabella of Castile married King Ferdinand of Aragon, and together they united Christian Spain. Through a series of battles, the Spanish Christians took city after city, freeing Christian captives from the dungeons, but at the same time imprisoning Muslims. Eventually, they won control of all of Moorish or Muslim Spain, except for the city of Granada. Located amid snow-capped mountains in southern Spain and protected by the Alhambra, possibly the most magnificent fortress ever built in a Muslim land, Granada was a formidable city indeed. The armies of Ferdinand and Isabella besieged Granada for 6 months and then offered terms of peace. If the city surrendered, those who chose to leave would be sent free of charge to Africa. Those who chose to remain had to acknowledge Ferdinand and Isabella as king and queen, but would be allowed freedom of worship and the right to be governed by their own laws, administered by Moorish rule. The Moors accepted, and the Emir of Granada emerged from the walls and presented the keys to the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. In a triumphant procession, the Spanish army marched into Granada. Cardinal Mendoza raised a great silver cross over the Alhambra, and Ferdinand and Isabella knelt in the city square to give thanks to the God who, after 781 years, had evicted Islam from Spain. One of those who marched into Granada with Ferdinand and Isabella was Christopher Columbus, and the date was January 2nd, 1492. World history is a huge, huge story, and within it there are thousands and thousands of smaller stories. And this is very important to understand about the story of Columbus. This victory for Spain was also a victory for Columbus when he finally found a sponsor for his voyage to seek a new route to the Indies. The Spanish king and queen were so grateful to God for freeing them from the Turks that they showed their gratitude to God by funding Columbus's voyage. It was very common in these times to do a public act of thanks to God for situations like this. And so their public act of thanks was to give Christopher Columbus the money and the ships he needed to make this voyage. Part of their mission and Columbus's mission was to spread the gospel of Jesus to any indigenous peoples they encountered, and to hopefully acquire gold to help pay for the Turkish wars. Now, Marxist historians will downplay Columbus's strong Catholic faith, as well as his skills as a navigator and sailor. At a time when sailors feared the open sea and carefully sailed near the continents, Columbus was one of the few navigators who dared to cross an open sea to an unknown destination. Armchair quarterbacks today act like this is no big deal, nothing to celebrate. Don't listen. The first part of Columbus's journal describes the voyage and the fears of his men that they would never spot land. In fact, his men were on the verge of mutiny when land was finally sighted. As they landed at the first island, the natives there were curious, a little hesitant, but somewhat welcoming. Columbus called them Indians because he thought he had reached the Indies or the Orient. He notes the differences between the different tribes on different islands, and this is a very key thing to notice. Every island had different groups of Indians, and they all behaved differently. This is why it's important to read the journals for yourself and to think critically. It was not a single race or tribe of Indians that Columbus encountered. It was multiple different tribes, some kind and friendly, some unfriendly, and between the tribes themselves there were varying levels of peace and war. By some, the Spaniards were received with kindness and awe, and even an attempt at worship. With others, the Spaniards had to quickly flee for safety. Some of the tribes fought for an alliance with the Spaniards to protect them from nearby warring tribes, and one chief even wanted to build a statue of Columbus. How ironic is that? Columbus had brought many gifts, and with each encounter, he presented these gifts, tried to communicate, asked questions about their location, sought the great Khan, believing he was in the Orient, and looked for hints of gold. But according to Howard Zinn and his devout followers, Columbus was an embodiment of colonialism and all that goes along with it: rape, murder, enslavement, warfare, control, conquest, and genocide. This is from a tweet that it resembles thousands of similar tweets, and I'm sourcing it here for you. But this is the narrative. I'm sure you've heard it. The funny thing is, none of these things were inherent to Columbus and his men. The Indians already had rape and murder, enslavement, warfare, control, conquest, and genocide. Oh, and they also had cannibalism and human sacrifice. Through sign language and observation, Columbus learned about a very evil tribe known to him as the Caribs. This is from his journal, October 11th, 1492. These people, the Caribs, raid the other islands and carry off all the women they can take, especially the young and beautiful, whom they keep as servants and concubines. They had carried off so many that in 50 houses we found no males, and more than 20 of the captives were girls. These women say that they are treated with a cruelty that seems incredible. The Caribs eat the male children that they have by them, and only bring up the children of their own women. And as for the men they are able to capture, they bring those who are alive home to be slaughtered and eat those who are dead on the spot. They say that human flesh is so good that there is nothing like it in the world. And this must be true, for the human bones we found in their houses were so gnawed that no flesh was left on them, except what was too tough to be eaten. In one house, the neck of a man was found cooking in a pot. They castrate the boys that they capture and use them as servants until they are men. Then, when they want to make a feast, they kill and eat them, for they say that the flesh of boys and women is not good to eat. 3 of these boys fled to us, and all 3 had been castrated. I don't know if you picked up on this fact, but they raped the women, had babies by them, and ate those babies when they grew up. This is one thing that the Columbus haters rarely mention: cannibalism and human sacrifice. Howard Zinn and others will take Columbus's words grossly out of context and claim that he found the Indians easy to enslave. The truth is actually quite the opposite. He repeatedly stated that they would be easily converted to the holy Christian faith through love and kindness, and not by force. Further, everyone in Spain was considered servants of the monarchs. When Columbus stated that the Indians would make good servants, he was stating that the Indians would make favorable citizens of their Majesty's government, because Spain was claiming these islands for their kingdom. During this first exploration voyage, one of the 3 ships, the Santa Maria, ran aground and had to be abandoned. Since there was not enough room on board the 2 remaining ships to sail everyone back to Spain, Columbus had to leave some of his men behind. So he left them on one of the islands and told them to build a trading fort and await his return. The next year, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella sent him back with many more men and ships. However, there were men in this new crew who did not share the monarch's or Columbus's goals or views of the islands or of the Indians there. This is where the trouble came from. But of course, it's all laid at the feet of one man, Christopher Columbus. So let's examine a few of the modern claims. Columbus was a racist. When you read the numerous descriptions in Columbus's journals, you will find that he esteems the Indians very highly based on appearances alone. Example, of the Indians on Cuba, he said this: "A better race there cannot be." On the next day, he repeated, "I believe that there can be no better people nor better land anywhere on earth." He praised them for their beauty, intellect, and gentleness. This is in his journals on December 24th and 25th of 1492. Columbus was an enslaver. First, please remember that the Indians themselves practiced slavery and had servants, as did the rest of the world. So the Spaniards did not introduce slavery to the Indians. Howard Zinn claims that Columbus said they would make fine slaves, but that's actually false. Columbus said they must be good servants, and it is translated this way by multiple historians, including the respectable Hakluyt Society and Samuel Eliot Morison. Zinn further claims that Columbus boasted this: "With 50 men we could subjugate them," as if that means that they would enslave them. That quote is out of Columbus's journals, but in context you find that Columbus was talking about the need to fight if the natives attacked them forcefully. The natives had only very primitive weapons. Columbus did take back some of the Indians to Spain with him after his first voyage to learn the language and to be acclimated to the Old World. Sadly, most of them died on the voyage. Columbus was a murderer and committed genocide. First, let's look at terms. Genocide is a term coined after the Holocaust that means the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. In 1494, a man named Peter Martyr, who was a historian of Columbus's day, said this: "As Columbus had never maltreated the natives, the inhabitants, both men and women, gladly brought him gifts, displaying no fear." You won't find genocide anywhere in Columbus's journals or the writings of his contemporaries. Some of the Spaniards who were under Columbus's authority actually rebelled against him and did all kinds of evil deeds to some of the Indians. What's often left out of revisionist history is the inconvenient fact about cannibalism. Contemporary sources of Columbus's day state that some islands and tribes had been completely wiped out by the cannibalistic tribes. That's genocide. After the Spaniards arrived, there were occasions of ruthless behavior. Factual history does not deny this. Columbus does not even deny this in his own journals. But as I said earlier, each tribe of Indians, each group of Spaniards on each individual island encountered different circumstances. There was no single rule, there was no decree of enslavement and murder. What we had was Romans 1 on full display: envy, greed, perversion, and death, because they did not honor God in their hearts. Columbus had his authority rescinded, and the governors of the islands after him were cruel to the natives. They disregarded Queen Isabella's command to not enslave or mistreat the natives. Columbus himself had a history of following Isabella's commands, and his own previous behavior tells us that he would not have treated the natives as those subsequent governors did. In fact, Columbus wrote to the king, quote, "I am informed that since I left this island, 6 parts out of 7 of the natives are dead, all through ill treatment and inhumanity, some by the sword, and others by blows and cruel usage, others through hunger." There are far too many details for me to share in this podcast, but there is a way for you to know all of it. The primary sources are numerous. It is a lazy American who will believe internet memes and debunked history when the facts have been recorded in print for centuries. Columbus was accompanied by several other men who also kept journals and verified his reports. Autobiographies and multiple eyewitnesses tell us the entire story of Columbus and what happened on those islands. Choosing to ignore this history is choosing to believe a Marxist lie. When someone tells you that they have a version of history that is reimagined or rethinks it, just run. Don't give them any time of day. Instead, read the primary sources. Read the journals. They're easy to read. There's literally no excuse for ignorance. I grew up homeschooled, reading books based on primary sources. This is one of them. In this children's book that was published in 1976, it cites 5 different editions of Columbus's journals in the bibliography, plus 3 books by Samuel Eliot Morison, and all of the books in the bibliography were published before 1974. Of the children's books that were cited in the bibliography, none was published after 1966. This is the kind of book that you learn the actual history from. It was because I grew up outside of Zinn's sphere of influence that I was surprised at the lies Americans were believing about Columbus and many of our American forefathers. This is also why I started a company called Knowledge Keepers Bookstore, reprinting American history books from 3 centuries previous. I have actually published Columbus's journals in this 2-volume book that includes a biography written by Edward Everett Hale in 1891 when they were celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyages. And it includes a 1906 edition of Columbus's journals. This has over 700 footnotes that explain everything in the journals. Trust me, they're not hard to read. It's not over your head. It's not just for academics. Multiple sources over 400 years are cited in the journals and letters. You will be amazed at the tidbits of information included in these footnotes. I was blown away at all the little rabbit trails of information that I learned. And along with my book on Columbus, I've created a free study guide for homeschoolers to use it with any history curriculum. So I'll share that link below. But at the end of the biography in this book, there's a quote by Edward Everett Hale, and it says this: Columbus met with many reverses and died, one might almost say, a broken-hearted man. But history has been just to him. Remember, this was 1891, and has placed him in the foremost rank of the men who have set the world forward. And outside of the technical study of history, those who like to trace the laws on which human progress advances have been proud and glad to see that there is a noble example of the triumph of faith. The life of Columbus is an illustration constantly brought forward of the success which God gives to those who, having conceived of a great idea, bravely determine to carry it through. His singleness of purpose, his unselfishness, his determination to succeed have been cited for 4 centuries and will be cited for centuries more among the noblest illustrations which history has given of success wrought out by the courage of one man. Well, here we are in 2025, and we see that history has suddenly not been kind to Columbus. But I would like to do my part to change that. Now, when I tell you that the entire fabricated hatred of Columbus is Marxist, please believe me. It's a branch of critical theory called colonial theory or post-colonial theory. Now, this is a topic for an entirely different podcast, but I just want to help you understand. You've heard of critical theory, critical race theory, critical gender theory. There's so many branches of critical theory, and this is only one of them. Post-colonial theory sees all of Western civilization as a corrupt, racist, sexist, imperialist, evil empire that must be dismantled and deconstructed. Post-colonial theory, like all woke theories, is built on a fusion of postmodernism and critical theory. And the goal of post-colonial theory is to do critical theory in a way that will dismantle, deconstruct, delegitimize, and otherwise invalidate Western society and ideals. Oh, and surprisingly, it's connected to Gaza. So I'll share a link to some of that information below. And I know this doesn't even make sense, but it all goes back to smashing capitalism and Western civilization. That's why it's all Marxism. Read the book Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay for more. Trust me on this. So it's not just that Columbus must be dismantled, but Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, the Pilgrims, the pioneers, and every other part of our history that involves some form of Christian or European descendant. The radicals want to destroy the West and everything that it stands for. Parents, please don't play their game. The 21st century critics of Columbus who topple statues and feign morality would not be able to do half of what Columbus did. Despite some miscalculations and misidentifications, and despite some errors in judgment, he was an amazing person who was born to accomplish great things, and the stories that are being told today are simply untrue. So if you want to know more about this, there are some books that you need to read. You need to be educated. Don't let the internet be your teacher. You can search the internet all day, and the search results will have a very hard time helping you to dig up this truth. And as a side note here, this is why I highly recommend that you stop using AI for your search engines, because AI only pulls up what is most popular already on the internet. And what's most popular on the internet is Marxist trash. So obviously, I recommend reading the journals. Again, this is published in my Knowledge Keepers book collection. This is a 2-volume book on Columbus. First, it's the biography written by Edward Everett Hale in 1891. And second is a 1906 edition of Columbus's journals. The entire Knowledge Keepers collection, by the way, is a collection of books written by eyewitnesses and participants in America's history, reprinted by me with no changes to the original text. And so I'll give you a link to the full collection below. Debunking Howard Zinn is a must-read. Mary Graybar has done an excellent work here. She exposed the author for not only being a fraudulent and lazy historian, but she dives deep into the deliberate errors in Zinn's story of Columbus and the Indians. And if you haven't, I do recommend reading Zinn's book, because you need to understand where the lies have come from. I actually am reading this with my teenagers in our homeschool along with Mary Graybar's book, so that they are familiar with the revisionist history. Another book that I really like is Columbus the Hero by Raphael. This book actually takes each of the modern myths about Columbus and sets the record straight from multiple primary resources. Not Stolen is something I quoted from a little earlier. This is an excellent work. The subtitle is The Truth About European Colonialism in the New World. So this not only talks about Columbus, but all the other stories from the Pilgrims and the pioneers, everyone who encountered Indians, and the truth about our relationships with the Indians. And again, it doesn't whitewash history as Marxists will claim. It examines the balanced truth. I mentioned Samuel Eliot Morison as a noted historian. This is just one of the books he wrote about Columbus, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. This is a pre-Zinn work, and this man was a naval officer and a historian, and he actually undertook a repeat of Columbus's voyages in, I don't remember what years it was, but I think this book was written in the 50s or the 60s. And you'll have to find a used copy, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, it is very important that as homeschool parents, all parents really should do this, that we understand the history. There are very trustworthy history curriculums for your kids, for history, and not just history, but all of them. But they don't print the whole journals. They don't help you understand what the lies in the culture are and help you to counter the lies. They teach you the history, and there are some good ones that are not Marxist. In fact, if you go to a homeschool convention, a Christian homeschool convention, and look for people that love their country and want to know the truth, that's where you'll find the best sources. However, that they're not going to give you the fact that cultural Marxism is warping the way Americans see our own history. And that's what I want to do with Knowledge Keepers books. So I really hope that you'll take the time, pick one of these books. If you want to start with one, I obviously recommend my Knowledge Keepers book, because it's got a biography of Columbus that is closely based on the journals. And then the journals are in the back of the book, heavily footnoted, so you can understand what's going on. And then the second one, that if you need an easy start, Columbus the Hero. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way through. And thank you for diving into the true history of the United States of America. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
You're listening to the Biblical Family Network.